Hmm. How's it going, class? This is going to be our second to last lecture. This is going to be on chapter 10, heat, cold, and altitude. Um, this is going to be the last lecture on anything that is from the book. The muscular healing chapter or the muscular healing lecture that we're going to do is going to be based on something outside the book, a little bit more based on my research. Much like the rest of this class, I'm very, very passionate about it and I love to talk about it. So it's going to be pretty surface level of what muscular healing is. I'm not going to get too in depth because this is not an immunology course. It's just going to be something that kind of basically understand and connect the dots of what's occurring when you actually elicit some sort of muscle damage. Before we get into that, we're going to do today's lecture, which is going to be heat, cold, and altitude. And hoping you guys are having a good semester so far. I know this class is online, so it's not as good as if it was in person. I personally myself do not enjoy online classes, and definitely do not enjoy teaching them as much, just because it's much harder for me to get feedback from you guys. I like to be very, very attentive to you guys as you sit in the course and have a lot of back and forth. This isn't really my style, so hopefully I'm doing a good enough job presenting this material to you guys, and hopefully the last couple lectures here will be good and a good way to wrap up the semester. So we'll jump on into the lecture here. So we're going to be talking about heat, cold, and altitude. So essentially, what we're going to be talking about today is just the different physiological changes that occur due to heat, cold, and altitude. So earlier in the semester, you probably heard me say acclimation, and then I also said acclimatization. No, I was not pronouncing acclimation wrong. There's a process called acclimatization, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this lecture. Essentially, today we're just going to be talking about how the body changes when it's exposed to these different stressors. So exercise in the heat. So essentially, what your body is trying to do is go through some sort of a balance. It wants to balance the amount of heat gain that you have from the exercise, from the environment, from metabolic heat production, whatever it might be, with your heat loss. So this has to do with just metabolic heat production from your exercise, and then the transfer of heat between the body and the environment. There's four different pathways of heat transfer. The first one we're talking about is convection. So this has to do with moving air or a moving fluid. It could be water. So this is having to do with the removal of heat uh, in a faster manner than the radiation because of the movement of some sort of fluid. And we see here we have radiation, so that's just the emission of electromagnetic radiation. That's just the normal way the heat moves. And so convection is kind of a sped up version of radiation. And then we have conduction, so this is direct transfer by contact. So this is how a burner heats the pot so you can cook your ramen noodles or whatever you might be having. Um, and then you have evaporation, which we've talked about before. It's going to be talked about a lot in this lecture. Evaporation is a loss of heat by the evaporation of water from the skin. And if we remember, that's how you lose or you get rid of body heat from sweating. You're not actually sweating out colder water, and that's what cools your skin. You're sweating out water that, when it changes from a liquid to a gas, draws energy from the skin, and that's what allows you to dissipate heat or dissipate energy. And so this is a flow diagram over here on the right, showing all different ways that you can lose or gain heat depending on what exercise you're doing. So physiological responses. So we should recognize this little graph up in the top right here. I'll move my ugly mug over to the left side of the screen here. You should recognize this. This is the phenomenon known as cardiac drift. And these are things that change as you go through cardiac drift. And cardiac drift occurs mostly during long-term exercise or in hot environment exercise due to either dehydration or increased core body temperature. And so in the heat, you're going to have increased core body temperature, as well as you're going to have increased muscle glycogen breakdown and increased metabolic rate. And as you can imagine, increased metabolic rate is going to lead to more heat production. So there's kind of this positive feedback loop, this accumulating effect where if you exercise in hot environments, your body begins to function more inefficiently and produce more internal heat, which then again is going to cause it to function more inefficiently. And that's going to again cause this perpetuating motion where the body is essentially accruing or increasing body heat at a higher level than it can dissipate, which makes the body less efficient. So because of this, you're going to redistribute blood flow. So you're going to see vasodilation of skin arterioles. So you're going to see a lot more blood flow to the skin so that you can dissipate that heat off into the environment. And that's why when you exercise, a lot of people's skin gets very red. Some people have it more than others. Some people's faces get very, very red when they exercise. It's because of the flush or the vasodilation of the capillaries and the arterioles in the skin, bringing more blood flow to the surface, as well as you're going to see increased heart rate. That's usually a manifestation of dehydration and lower blood volume. as well as cardiac drift, so cardiovascular system overload. So essentially, with the dehydration, with the increased temperature, you're seeing a decrease in the efficiency of the cardiac system due to a multitude of factors, as well as you're going to increase your sweat rate. And if you're not properly hydrating during these hot environment exercises, you're going to be going through stages of dehydration. The transfer of body heat and other factors. So humidity, so relative humidity is the amount of water vapor present in the air and expressed by a percentage. So whatever the maximum saturation of water is at that given temperature, the humidity is the percentage of that maximum saturation. So 80% humidity at 95 degrees is going to be different than 80% humidity at 55 degrees. And that is because we should know hot air retains more water. So if you have a very, very hot day at 90-degree humidity, there's a lot more water in the air than if you have, let's say, 60-degree day at 90% humidity. As well as we should know, potentially we've heard of the dew point. Essentially, the dew point is a point at which water would begin to dissipate out of the air if the temperature were to drop that low. So if the dew point is 75, that means at 75 degrees, water will begin to dissipate out of the air. And so this is important for cooling and the cooling capacity of sweat. So as we remember, the sweat going through the process of evaporating is actually how you lose body heat. And if there's more water vapor in the air, it is much more difficult for that sweat to evaporate. There is a lower evaporation gradient, and therefore not as much sweat will evaporate, and you will not dissipate as much heat. And that's why in humid environments, sometimes you feel like you're sweating more, but also you feel much, much warmer because you're not losing that heat through evaporation of sweat like you usually would be. So these are all health risks during exercise, and the heat all factors influence degree of heat stress. So these are all different things that are going to affect your heat stressors. So metabolic heat production, air temperature, water pressure, vapor, air velocity, radiant heat sources, clothing. All these different factors are going to lead to different degrees of heat exhaustion or heat stroke. Obviously, if you are producing a lot of heat through metabolism, if it's really hot out, really humid, if there's no wind, if the sun is beating on you, and if you're wearing long sleeves, you're going to be a lot more likely to suffer dehydration and heat stroke than if you were in a moderate environment with the proper clothing and moving air. So here is essentially a graph, the real feel, the danger of exercising at certain temperatures. And as we can see here, there is a major effect of humidity on the real field of temperature. So at 90, let's say 94 degrees, pretty common temperature in Florida, 94 degrees at 40% humidity only feels like 97. It's not too bad. But if you get to like the 60 to 70% humidity that we see a lot in Florida here, it'll feel almost like 120 degrees out. Okay, and so Florida, usually in this 92 to 96 window, usually in this like 60 to 80 window, is really, really predominantly in this very dangerous level of exercise. And if you look really closely here, you can actually see you can see, Orlando here and, Miami here and Jacksonville here and, and Tampa over here. And you have the state of Florida essentially. So we got drawing of Florida. There we go. That's good enough. That looks like Florida, right? It's obviously a joke, but in reality, a lot of Florida spends most of its time in this little window here. And these are extremely dangerous temperatures to be exercising in. And so if you're a practitioner of exercise or you're a coach down here, you want to be keeping this in mind as you put your athletes through exercise. This is the wet bulb globe index. So essentially this can tell you your work to rest ratio that you should be doing in certain heats and if you are doing certain levels of work, as well as your water intake. And you can see here, if you are acclimated in doing light work, you really only need to take half a quart per hour and you can work continuously. But as you get to more extreme, let's say that you are in a high heat environment and you are acclimated, you really should be doing half rest, half exercise, or half work, and you should be having about 3/4 a quart of water. And then in extreme, let's say you are even if you are exercise or see, even if you are highly acclimated, you are doing heavy work in a high stress environment, you should be having at least 1 quart per hour. So in an 8-hour workday, you're having 2 gallons of water, 2 gallons of fluid specifically, in order to maintain hydration status and not go into stages of heat exhaustion or dehydration. These are all just factors that play into heat-related illness. So if you have any one of these or a combination of these, the more of these you have in combination is obviously going to lead to a greater amount of heat-related illness incidents. So heat acclimation, so acclimation versus acclimatization, okay? Acclimation is more doing with a specific physiological change due to some sort of stressor in the environment. So if it's hot, you are increasing sweat rate, you're increasing sweating efficiency, you're increasing cardiac output. Those are acclimations to a certain stressor. Acclimatization is the change in behavior and the overarching combination of all physiological processes that occurs when you are in a stressor. So this has to do with changes in behavior, has to do with the acclimation of all the different acclimations that leads to a better ability for you to essentially survive and perform in that environment. And so usually it occurs the best, or you have your peak acclimation in about 7 to 14 days. So if you want to perform your best in an environment that's going to be very, very different to you, you want to try to get there 7 to 14 days ahead of time to make sure that you are fully acclimating and going through acclimatization for the environment. So in hot environments, you're going to see increased sweating efficiency, so more effective cooling. So you're also going to see an earlier onset of sweating. So essentially you are preparing for that increased body temperature earlier. You're going to see greater sweat production. So more production of sweat means more evaporation. And then you're going to reduce the electrolyte loss in sweat. So something that can occur if you were sweating too profusely is you begin to lose a lot of very essential electrolytes too often or in too high of a magnitude. So what the body does is it compensates and it releases more dilute sweat, so you're not losing electrolytes as much. And this makes sense. Just like everything else in the body, at your baseline, you're not at your most efficient. That's a poster you can hang up on your wall next to your live, laugh, love poster is some sort of baseline or some sort of poster that says, your baseline is not your capacity, right? If you are, or your baseline is not your full potential, or some Tumblr bullcrap, right? Anybody at any one point can always be trained to become more efficient in really anything. And that even goes for your sweat rate here. Just your sweating is not as most efficient unless you were properly acclimated to a certain environment, as well as you're going to improve your thirst reflex. This makes sense. If you're getting thirsty earlier or your thirst reflex is more strong of a stimulus, you're going to be drinking more water in your slow dehydration, as well as you'll see increases in blood plasma volumes, helps with cardiac output, and then mitigating cardiac drift. And after acclimation, you're going to be able to exercise the same absolute intensity. So athlete A who is acclimated versus athlete B, athlete A is going to have a lower body temperature at any at any absolute work rate. So if they're both running at 10 miles an hour for a certain period of time, if you are acclimated, you're going to have lower core body temperature, which means you're going to be closer to your optimal temperature, and therefore you're going to perform to a higher capacity. With that, you see increased skin blood flow, you're going to see a lower rating of perceived exertion and lower muscle glycogen metabolism. If you remember, muscle glycogen metabolism produces a lot of heat. So you're trying to limit that to a certain capacity so that you're not producing too much heat. You see the effects of acclimation over 12 days. We see here at about the 8 to 12 or 8 to 10 day mark, you begin to see this plateau of the acclimations. You can see a little bit more at the end of each of these, but essentially, usually about 10-ish days is a good enough time to get the bulk of your acclimation effects. Well as for temperature and heart rate at any given exercise time, if you were acclimated, you're going to be seeing decreases in your core body temperature and decreases in your heart rate, which, as you can imagine, are going to be better for your exercise. And then fluid intake, we see how important fluid intake is. If after a certain period of time, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, if you are not properly intaking fluid, you're going to see this increase in core body temperature as measured by rectal temperatures. You're going to see an increase in core body temperature that is going to be detrimental to your performance. So you want to make sure that you are adequately consuming liquids or fluids during your exercise time in the heat, which we should all know. So thermal flux, so this is basically just a balance scale, like a filling of the cup. Heat generation is filling the cup, heat dissipation is emptying the cup. If the thermal load, right, if your heat generation is going up faster than your heat dissipation can bring it down, you're going to overflow the cup and you're going to have detrimental effects. Just like if you're in the cold and heat dissipation is too much and your heat generation is not as much, you're going to drain the cup too much and it's not going to be good either. And that's why you see in hot environments, you'll see them wearing cooling vests, drinking cold beverages, being in front of cooling vans. Those are all things that are good to help you lower your body temperature. And now, a ice bath, while it may be useful for in certain extreme medical scenarios, is not super useful in acute scenarios because what it actually does is the cold causes the blood flow to shunt away from the skin, which can cause it to be stored more in internal organs, and it may not be as beneficial for you as just standing in front of, let's say, a cooling fan. See the performance in heat, so we see in highly trained or acclimated people, excuse me, or we see in habitually trained individuals, and people who are acclimated. We have people who are acclimated in the NT dot here. So people that are acclimated are going to have a higher power output at any given exercise time, as well as those who've gone through pre-cooling. So if you pre-cooled yourself before an exercise, you're going to have lower body temperature at any given exercise time compared to somebody who had gone through a control or was just doing preheating. And so essentially you're preparing yourself for the exercise by cooling your body down so that when the heat accumulation begins, you are not in as big of a trouble right away. So heat illness, so heat cramps. So we've all gone through involuntary muscle spasms, or more than likely most of us have gone through them. Heat cramps. Remember, we don't really know for sure the exact mechanism of causing cramps. We know that there are a few that play into it. We know that a combination of them is likely what causes cramps, but there really is not any one specific mechanism that causes it. And so it might be related to hydration, it might be related to heat, but that probably has more to do with fluid loss, with electrolyte loss, with exercise intensity, with core body temperature. A whole bunch of different things probably play into this. But we do know is that individuals with prior history tend to have higher probability of cramping, and that's likely due to the fact that their compensatory reaction or their compensatory mechanisms for exercising in the heat are not as efficient as somebody else. So heat syncope or fainting, so this is due to a drop in blood pressure. So the combination of vasodilation to the skin and then quick standing can cause a lack of blood flow to the brain, which can cause a faint or a fainting-like feeling. And then there's hyponatremia. And so this has to do with low concentration of sodium in the blood. So this is what I talked about before. In high school, when we were drinking like a gallon and a half or 2 gallons of water before a game, and then everybody started having a lot of the symptoms you see here, not as extreme as this, but really we went through hyponatremia in the fact that we were diluting the amount of electrolytes and diluting the amount of sodium in our bodies. And so we did have some people puking. We had people that are dizzy. We had muscular weakness. We didn't have anything extreme, and so obviously nobody had to be brought to the hospital. But essentially, overhydrating yourself can have detrimental effects itself. And if you are drinking just water throughout the day and not getting the proper electrolyte intake like sodium, you can see negative effects as well. The heat illness, so we have heat exhaustion. So heat exhaustion is anything with a core body temperature below 104. You're gonna feel faint, dizzy, nausea, vomiting. We've all probably felt some effects of heat exhaustion before. Heat stroke now is the more extreme example. This is a medical emergency when your core temperature rises above 104 degrees. In this, you want to try to drop their core body temperature at least a quarter of a degree per minute in ice water or in some sort of very, very cold environment. As well as these individuals may lose consciousness. So this is another emergency that you want to be aware of. And obviously, you want to make sure that your athletes aren't getting to heat stroke and you are catching it early on in heat exhaustion. It's kind of flow chart of symptoms and signs that you can look at as people go through heat illness and looking at how detrimental they are. And essentially that wraps up heat. So we're going to talk about exercise in the cold. And so this is a little bit more detrimental, or excuse me, this is a little bit more dear to home for me. This is a lot more of what I dealt with in North Dakota. We didn't play a lot of sports per se in the snow, but I did a lot of work outside in the snow, as well as we would play in the spring and the fall. And we get pretty cold. There's baseball games I remember playing in the spring where we playing it's 40, 45 degrees out, as well as in the fall. If you're playing football, that was when a couple times you'd play in the snow, and it's cold. And there are considerations to keep in mind when you are keeping athletes or keeping individuals exercising in these environments. And so we see heat loss is greater in windy or wet conditions. That makes sense. We've all been outside when it's warm or even when it's cold. If it is windier out, you are going to lose more body heat more quickly. If it's 60 degrees out and it's calm, it's not that bad. 60 degrees out and it's windy, then it can feel cold. Now, for me, that doesn't feel too bad, but I know from a lot of people from Florida, if it rains and it's windy and it's 60 degrees out, people are outside in their sweatshirts and their jeans and they're shivering because they're not used to it. And the wind pulls a lot of heat away from the body very fast, as well as water has a thermal conductivity 26 times greater than air. So water or heat loss through water is 4 times faster versus cold air. And so if you are in a cool water pool, or if you're in a lake, you are going to lose heat much faster than if you were standing outside. And so I know this is pretty common in the lakes in Minnesota that we used to go to all the time. is people would stay in the water when it was like, 65, 70 degrees out, and they'd be like, oh, it feels warmer in the water. That's not actually true. You're actually dissipating more heat in the water more quickly. It's just that that wind on you initially feels cold when you stand up in the air, but in reality, once that water evaporates off you, you're going to lose body heat less quickly if you were just out in the air versus being in the water. That's why if you've ever seen any survival shows in the cold, or you've seen the movie Eight Below, or any movie like that, when they fall through the ice, they talk about how first thing you do is make sure you don't drown. Drowning happens a lot faster than hypothermia. But the next thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you can get them out of anything wet. So you want to make sure they're out of their wet clothing as fast as possible. That's why you'll see individuals when they talk about this for survival scenarios. If they get their clothing wet, they'll either strip their clothing, and they'd rather be bare skinned in the environment than in wet clothing, because the cold air will strip their body heat less quickly or to a slower manner than the cold water soaked clothing they have would. As well as looking at this respiratory heat loss, about 8% of total metabolic heat production. So you have greater fluid loss through respiration in cold environments. And we'll talk about this in altitude environments too. But in cold environments, not only do you lose heat, but you also lose fluid through your respirations. Back here. So physiological responses to the cold. So you have the vasomotor response, so peripheral vasoconstriction in peripheral vasoconstriction in the periphery. It's a typo. It's obvious, right? Peripheral vasoconstriction. So essentially, you're having blood flow shunted away from your skin, which is the opposite of a heat environment, right? So it reduces convective heat transfer between the cold, or excuse me, between the core and the skin. So you don't want to be dropping core body temperature by shunting that blood flow to the skin. So you shunt it away from the skin. The goal here is to limit heat loss, and that makes sense. Metabolic response, so you increase metabolic heat production, shivering. So shivering is fueled by glucose specifically. And so if you are shivering, you are increasing your heat production, which is going to make your body feel warmer. Also, you're going to see an increase in stroke volume and little change in resting heart rate. You may also see a bradycardic response. So you see such an increase in stroke volume that you actually see a little bit of a drop in the heart rate. So body composition has effects on heat loss as well. So as we should know, more fat means more insulation. And so if you are in a cold environment, or you have people that live in a cold environment, generally they have higher caloric diets so that they can handle the cold environment better than, let's say, if they were very, very skinny. So physiological responses to exercise in the cold. So you're going to see decreased muscle function. You see less motor unit recruitment, decrease in contractile force, shortening velocity and power decreases. Affects our superficial muscles. Deep muscles are usually spared. So if you've ever been outside in the cold and your hand gets really cold, it's really, really hard to curl your hands or move your hands, right? That has a lot to do with what we're talking about here. Glucose metabolic responses are going to increase. So muscle glycogen utilization increases. This is what supplies shivering. So similar blood glucose response as thermoneutral exercise. So increase muscle glycogen usage. So essentially what they're saying is just being in a cold environment can increase glycogen utilization almost to the same effect as if you were just exercising in a normal environment. Now, I'm not saying it's going to burn the same amount of calories, but the shift from balancing fat and glycogen usage to using mostly glycogen is very, very similar in cold environments as it would be as if you were exercising. Well, we're going to see decrease in free fatty acid metabolic responses. So normally increased catecholamines leads to increased free fatty acid oxidation, having a stroke here. But in the cold, no free fatty acid oxidation with catecholamine secretion. So essentially, usually with catecholamines being released, you would see increases. But in the cold, even though catecholamines are increasing, you're not seeing an increase in FFA oxidation. So what it's telling you is that your body, again, is preferentially utilizing glycogen as a fuel source because it creates more metabolic heat and therefore can supply you with a higher core body temperature. Protective mechanisms, so body composition, so surface area to mass ratio. So body surface area to mass ratio being lower means you have lower heat loss. That's why you see in, let's say, some ancient human civilizations, let's say, ancient species, but the Neanderthals, they were short and stout because they lived in cold environments versus the Cro-Magnon, who were in the African continent, very tall and slender because of the body surface to mass ratio difference. Those that are shorter and stockier are going to have lower body surface area, which means a lower ability to dissipate heat, which means they can retain that heat, and that's good for cold environments. Um, Through your acclimatization, you're going to see blunting and shivering and cold-induced vasoconstriction. And with this, you see the hunting response. So essentially, what you see is you see this up and down of perfusion of the capillaries in the hands or in the outer extremity. So essentially, what happens is you see initial vasoconstriction here, and then you see a vasodilation response. And essentially, what that does is it just a off and on mechanism to keep you through going, to keep you from experiencing frostbite as quickly as if you were to shunt blood flow away entirely and therefore leave the fingers, let's say, to fend for themselves and have to produce their own heat. But if you do this kind of off and on again effect, it helps you to maintain the most heat, but also helps you protect those outer extremities. Here we're talking about shivering. Utilizes glycogen as a fuel to produce involuntary muscle contractions to generate heat. Shivering can reach intensities equivalent to up to 40% of maximal oxygen consumption. So that's a pretty good clip that I would say that'd be about you in a very light jog. So again, this is showing that just being in a cold environment can elicit enough of a stressor to the body to get the body to work at about 40% of your maximal oxygen consumption. And then we talk about goosebumps. Goosebumps are mostly useless in humans. Now, they do have an effect. They do manifest when you feel cold, but goosebumps are actually relatively inefficient at maintaining body heat. So protective mechanisms to acclimation, so more efficient responses to cold, this makes sense. Enhanced heat conservation mechanisms. You increase thermogenesis, so you increase metabolic heat produced by the breakdown of food. Then you enhance the efficiency of your shivering. So these are all ways in which you can maintain body heat to a greater capacity if you were in a very cold environment. As well as we're going to talk about adipose tissue, so brown fat, which we talked about before. More mitochondria, which means more metabolism, which means more heat production. Is present in adults again, but the extent is not clear. And in colder situations, colder environments, people tend to have higher stores of brown fat cells, as well as females, younger and healthier individuals, and to also have higher stores of brown fat cells. And then finally, we're going to talk about acute altitude exposure. So acute altitude exposure, we'll talk about barometric pressure, so the weight of the air above the measuring point. So essentially, this is telling you the relative pressure of the air, the weight of the air based on an average. So air, which we talked about before, is mostly nitrogen, about 79%, almost 80% nitrogen, and only about 20 to 21% oxygen. So the standard atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, but only 159 millimeters of mercury is oxygen. And you can think about this as pressure or just parts. So only about that amount of the total pressure is actually oxygen. So partial pressure of oxygen is always 20.93, just the total pressure of the air goes down. And so the any relative pressure that we see here, if we have 760 versus the barometric pressure being 253, we see that the O2 percentage in the air is always the same. But just like the partial pressure, or just like the full barometric pressure, the partial pressure of oxygen also decreases with elevation. And that's why it feels harder to breathe. Excuse me, that's not why it feels harder to breathe. It feels harder to breathe just because the total pressure of oxygen is lower. The actual change in the percentage of oxygen does not occur. There's no change in oxygen percentage. I'm messing this up big, so I apologize with this. I'll restate this. The actual reason that you cannot breathe as efficiently at high altitudes is because the partial pressure of the air and the partial pressure of oxygen is lower. There's not actually a lower percentage of oxygen in the air. We've talked about this before, so I don't know why I had a struggle trying to explain it. But essentially, there is just less total oxygen in the air because there's less total air. There's less total particles entirely in the air. And therefore, it's harder for you to drive that air into your lungs so that you can breathe that oxygen. See a smaller gas exchange gradient at altitude. So for any individual, the starting gas exchange, the starting partial pressure of oxygen in your arterial circuit is not going to be as high as if you were at sea level, and therefore there's not going to be as much oxygen to extract from the blood at the muscular level. There's a few factors that play in. So you have low air temperature. Temperature decreases 1 degree as you go up in altitude. contributes to the risk of cold-related disorders. Low humidity, so low water vapor, which means dry air, and you're quick to dehydrate via skin and the lungs. So not only are you going to dehydrate quickly because you're losing it through sweat, but also because you're breathing out moisture. And then high solar radiation, so UV rays travel through less atmosphere. Snow reflects these. So these are all different environment conditions that can affect you when you are in high altitude exposure events. So physiological responses to acute altitude exposure. So you're going to see pulmonary ventilation. So you're going to increase breathing immediately. So this occurs at rest and during submaximal exercises, but not maximal exercise. And the reason that doesn't occur more at maximal exercise is because you are already at maximal. Essentially, you're going to reach maximal earlier. So the partial pressure of oxygen stimulates chemoreceptors in the aortic arch of your carotid. So it's increased ventilation and increased O2 availability. So because there's not as much O2 in the air, you need to ventilate more often to try to keep the saturation of oxygen in your arteries the same. So your tidal volume, the size of your breaths, is going to increase for several hours and even several days. Ventilation at altitude can also lead to hyperventilation, which will cause respiratory alkalosis. And so we talked about before, right? You breathing out CO2 is how you battle acidity. So you battle acidosis within the body. But if you are breathing more rapidly in a state where you are not producing a lot of acidosis, you are going to go into alkalosis. And this is where the bicarbonate buffering system backfires. Essentially, now you are breathing more rapidly than you need because you were trying to just get oxygen in, but you are also dissipating more CO2 than you should be, which causes a shift from acidosis to alkalosis in a more extreme manner than you need. And it's going to be also just as detrimental to your body as acidosis would. We want to be at a specific pH for performance. And if you are too high or too low, you're going to see detriments to performance. So in this case, the hyperventilation is going to be negative for your performance. Respiratory, like we say, high blood pH. Blood is more basic, so alkalosis is the same thing as saying basic. The oxyhemoglobin curve shifts left, so you have a greater affinity for O2. So essentially, this helps to prevent further hypoxia-driven hyperventilation. And so what really occurs is that your body adapts and the muscles adapt at being better able to extract oxygen through the blood so that your ventilation rate does not need to remain high. So because your ventilation rate is high, you are going into the state of alkalosis, and your body doesn't like that. So what it does is it becomes more efficient at extracting whatever oxygen there is in the blood so that your ventilations do not need to remain high, and therefore you're not putting yourself into an alkalosis stressor. The kidneys will excrete more bicarbonates. This minimizes the blood buffering capacity, and it helps to reverse alkalosis, so blood pH decreases to normal. So physiological responses to acute altitude exposure. So short term, you're going to see a drop in plasma volume within a few hours. This has a lot to do with respiratory water loss and urine production. You're going to see a loss up to 25% of your plasma volume. So a big thing you want to do when you are going to an altitude or going high in altitude and exercising is you want to make sure you are increasing your water or your fluid intake. From this, you're going to see a short-term increase in hematocrit. Hematocrit within the bloodstream, which is going to allow you to transfer more oxygen. Red blood cell is also going to increase after weeks or months. So you're going to see EPO released from the kidneys, which is going to cause an increase in red blood cell production from the bone marrow, which is going to cause long-term increases in your hematocrit, which is going to be more beneficial for you going forward. Cardiac output is going to increase despite plasma volume and stroke volume. At rest, some maximal exercise, but not maximal. And so your body's not really changing at maximal here, but at rest and at sub-maximal intensities, you're going to see an increase in cardiac output. So you can get more O2 delivered to the tissues. And this makes sense. If you are not getting as much oxygen in per breath or per heartbeat, you want to make sure that you are increasing cardiac output so that even though the saturation of oxygen in the blood is lower, there's more oxygen flowing past so the muscles can extract more oxygen. Okay, so the oxygen saturation in your blood is lower, so in order to compensate for this, cardiac output increases so that you can get more oxygen flowing to the muscles, even though the relative concentration of the oxygen in the blood is lower. And then after a few days, like I said, muscles become more efficient at extracting oxygen, and you'll see a greater AVO2 difference, which causes a reduced need for the demand of the increased cardiac output. Aerobic exercise. So we see here, so your VO2 max as you go up in altitude. you're going to see a decrease in your VO2 max levels. Essentially, what this is saying is with the decrease in pressure that we see up here and the increase in altitude that we see up here every 1,000 meters, you see a drop in the individual's ability to utilize oxygen. So their VO2 max, the maximum amount of oxygen they can utilize, is dropping as you increase in altitude. So VO2 max can decrease from 62 to 15 from sea level to Mount Everest. So a highly, highly trained individual can have VO2 max of 62, which is very high. When they get to Mount Everest, because there is not as much total oxygen in the air, that means they're not able to get as much oxygen into their body, and therefore their body is not as able to use it for fuel. So you can imagine you're functioning at like a fourth of your capacity here. You are not able to exercise in an extreme manner, and that's why climbing to the top of Mount Everest or climbing very, very high mountains is so difficult, because you need to, first of all, become acclimated to this, but also, even when you are acclimated to it, you still have a massive decrease in your ability to extract oxygen and utilize it for fuel production. So optimizing training and performance, 2 strategies for sea level athletes who must compete at altitude. So the first thing to do is to compete as soon as possible after arriving at altitude. So it takes time for acclimation, but even though you have not acclimated yet, so it's pretty soon, and you're not going to see as many of the adverse effects of the altitude. So if you can get yourself to your performance and get performing right away, you're not going to see as many of the negative effects, and therefore you don't really need to rely on acclimation. Or the more efficient way to do it, and definitely be the more beneficial way for you to do it, is to train high for 2 weeks before competing. So you get past the worst adverse effects of the altitude, as well as you're going to get the acclimative and the acclimatization of the effects within your body that allow you to perform at a higher capacity. So chronic exposure to altitude, so performance improved, but may never match that at sea level. So even if you become really, really acclimated to a high altitude environment, you may never be able to match what you can do at sea level, just because the body cannot quite adapt and perform at as high capacity as it could when there's readily available oxygen. So 3 weeks are required at moderate altitude. So we said before, usually about a week to two to fully acclimate, but as you get higher and higher and higher, the amount of time that it takes becomes more and more and more to acclimate to certain environments. And that makes sense. The more extreme the environment becomes, the more time it takes you to acclimate to that environment. So you're going to see pulmonary adaptations, so increased ventilations at rest and during some maximal exercise, which we talked about before. Again, as well as the blood adaptations, so you're going to see changes in red blood cell count and hematocrit, which allow for greater oxygen delivery. Increased red blood cell count, so we see hematocrit about 45% at sea level, and then about 4,500 meters, it goes up to about 60%. And with this, hemoglobin is increasing proportional to elevation, and the oxyhemoglobin curve may or may not shift. So it's very individualized. The ability of the oxygens themselves to shift or to extract oxygen is going to increase with altitude, but certain individuals have a capacity to increase oxyhemoglobin more than others. So initially, plasma volume decreases due to that early loss of blood volume due to the dehydration. But after habituation and acclimation to chronic exposure to alcohol, you're going to see an increase in plasma volume, which allows you to deliver more blood to the muscles. Nutritional considerations. So with this, dehydration occurs faster. So you want to be making sure that you are increasing fluid intake, like I talked about. You're also going to have exacerbated sweating with exercise. So you need to consume 3 to 5 liters per day or more. If you're exercising in a hot and highly elevated environment, you might even need to intake more fluid, which I think we'll talk about in a second here. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second here. You want to make sure that you're treating heat, cold, and altitude all as separate stressor or separate exposures, and providing the proper acclimation for your athletes for each individual one of those. As well as you're going to see appetite decreases. So paired with increased metabolism, your appetite is going to decrease in a counterproductive way. So athletes and climbers must be educated about eating at altitude. So even though your metabolism is going up, your appetite is suppressed. And so a lot of people will get into states of starvation when they're at higher altitudes, because they just don't feel like eating, even though their metabolism is much higher. As well as you need to maintain or increase your iron intake to help support that increases in hematocrit. We remember that iron is extremely important for oxygen distribution, because it is the main heme in the main heme group of the red blood cell. Again, another stroke for me. I apologize. It's a long day here. But essentially, you want to be increasing your iron intake so that that replenishment and that building of red blood cells is more able to happen. So anaerobic performance is unaffected. So thinner air, less air resistance. So we'll take a peek at this here. So we see in 1964 Tokyo versus high elevation Mexico City. So relatively low elevation Tokyo, high elevation Mexico City. We see in short races, maybe a little bit faster because there's less air resistance. But we see here in long-term races, like say like look at the 5,000, the air resistance is as important, or the air resistance is not as important. And we see realistically what's occurring is the lack of oxygen because people weren't properly acclimated. You're seeing the times increase. We're seeing these massive jumps in time, an 8-minute increase in a marathon, or as much as a 3-minute increase in 10,000 meter because there's less oxygen in the air and it's a hot environment. So you're seeing decreases in performance. Living high, training low, effective moderate altitude acclimatization, and low altitude training on performance. So essentially what this is there's a lot of research coming out lately saying what's the best thing to do. Do you want to live high, train low? Do you want to live high, train high? Do you want to live low, train low? Essentially what the idea is this is essentially summed up into a couple sentences. What it really is saying is that you want to live high and train high and low. And so what this does is it gives you or it gets you natural acclimation to the high altitude, but also if you were training high and low, you're training low, which allows you to train at a higher capacity, but also training high so that your training is matching whatever your performance is. So altitude increases blood volume, red blood cell count, and hemoglobin. VO2 max is increased with altitude exposure, and high-low is the only group with increased steady-state VO2 max. And so if you're living high, training low, as well as living high and training high, you're going to see the best combination of all these. And I know this is kind of confusing to look at. There's a lot of data here, but the most recent literature is saying live high, train high and low. So I'm not going to go into this in too great detail. And we see here, our maximal oxygen uptake is good if you are living high, training high. But if you are living high, training low, you're actually going to see an increase in maximal steady state VO2. And so these are the things that you're trying to balance between living high, training high, and living high and training low in order to have the best boost to your performance. So you can do this. You can do this in a low environment. So let's say you wanted to go to a low environment to train there. You could be having yourself sleeping in hypobaric conditions. So you put yourself, where you sleep 8-9 hours, or you're in bed for 10 hours because you're looking at TikTok for the hour before, and you take a while to get out of bed. You can put yourself in a hypoxic situations where you are lowering the partial pressure of oxygen around you so that you are essentially effectively living low or living high and stimulating your body to have reactive mechanisms or acclimation to those environments. Another thing we're going to talk about here is altitude training masks. So they work by making it more difficult to breathe. So it does not change the partial pressure of oxygen-inspired air. It does not change the air at all. Endurance performance is actually limited by the amount of oxygen you get, not by the amount of air you get. So all it really does, all these masks do, is work to train your respiratory muscles. So it increases the function of the muscles that are pulling on your rib cage and pulling open your lungs. It's not actually changing the amount of oxygen that you're getting in per breath. So it's really not effective for training. So it may be effective at treating disease, but they don't actually stimulate hypoxia. But masks that do, like we see on the right bottom here, this mask that he actually is controlling the airflow might be beneficial for altitude training. So again, don't use oxygen or air restrictive masks. Make sure that if you're doing this, you're using actual masks that control for the flow of air and oxygen. So essentially, as a summary, or it's gonna be a summary of what we talked about today: heat, cold, altitude training. Essentially, you want to get yourself there a couple weeks beforehand if you want to become acclimated to the temperature. You want to make sure that you are keeping in consideration what is occurring physiologically. Some of these things are kind of counterintuitive. You wouldn't think that just because you're going to a high environment that you are going to be losing a lot of fluid or that you're going to be losing your appetite. But with this knowledge, this is something to keep in mind as you guys go through your own training, as you guys are practitioners of exercise or whatever it might be. You want to make sure that you are accounting for all of these changes. So I'm not going to go through these too much because I really, really repeat a lot of the same things over and over, as well as I've gone through a lot of these things here. But essentially, this is going to be the last chapter again from the book. A lot of these questions that are going to be on the exam coming up are going to be applied questions. So you probably don't need to remember the direct effect of something, but you need to understand the overall concept. You should understand that if you are in a high altitude environment and you are losing hydration through sweat loss and through breathing, what effects are that going to have on your performance? So you're going to have decreased cardiac output because of the drop in blood volume. You're going to have decreased oxygen delivery because of thickening of the blood. All sorts of different things here are going to play into these factors. So what you need to do is you need to keep in mind that these physiological mechanisms by which your body goes through acclimation, in which your body goes through training, your body goes through healing, all these things, these are complex mechanisms. And so it's important for you to look at this as a big picture thing rather than trying to memorize each individual thing. So I apologize if today's lecture was a little bit all over the place, but I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.